Let's talk about what's actually true when it comes to driving on I-95, because there's a wave of videos right now telling seniors they're 1 mile marker away from an instant fine because of some brand new 2027 law nobody's ever heard of. Before we get into the laws that genuinely matter, I have to clear up something because a lot of what's circulating is either exaggerated or flat out invented, and I don't want you making decisions based on fear instead of facts. There is no single sweeping law that took effect on I-95 this year, specifically targeting older drivers. I-95 runs through 15 states from Maine all the way down to Florida, and each of those states sets its own traffic laws. There is no federal statute that singles out senior drivers on this particular highway with automatic penalties, and if a video tells you there's some universal rule that applies the same way from Massachusetts to Miami, that claim doesn't hold up, because traffic law simply doesn't work that way in this country. What is true, and what's actually worth your attention, is that several states along that corridor have been tightening enforcement on a handful of specific violations, and the penalties for those violations have genuinely gotten stricter in the past couple of years. So let's go through what's real, because the real version of this story is useful, and the exaggerated version just makes people anxious for no reason. The first law worth understanding is the move over law, and this is the one that catches the most people off guard, seniors and younger drivers alike. Every state I-95 passes through has some version of a move over law on the books, and the basic rule is the same everywhere, even though the specifics vary. If you see a vehicle stopped on the shoulder with flashing lights, whether that's a police car, an ambulance, a tow truck, a utility vehicle, or in a growing number of states now, any disabled vehicle with hazard lights on, you are required to move over a full lane if you can safely do so. And if you can't change lanes because of traffic, you're required to slow down significantly below the posted speed limit as you pass. What's changed recently isn't the existence of this law, it's the enforcement. Several states along I-95, including Florida, Virginia, and Maryland, have expanded what counts as a violation and increased the fine amount substantially, with some states now charging several $100s for a first offense and treating repeat violations as a much more serious offense that can affect your license. The reason this one catches so many senior drivers specifically is habit. If you've been driving for decades, you learn to move over for police and ambulances, but the newer expansions of this law that now include tow trucks and even ordinary disabled vehicles with hazards on haven't caught up with muscle memory yet for a lot of longtime drivers. And that gap is exactly where these citations are happening. The second law that's tightened significantly and genuinely matters is the hands-free driving requirement. This isn't new in the sense of being invented in the last year, but the enforcement mechanism has changed in a way that specifically affects how these citations get issued, and that's worth understanding. A majority of the states along I-95 now have hands-free laws that prohibit holding a phone at all while driving, not just texting, meaning even holding your phone to talk, glancing at a map app propped in your hand, or scrolling while stopped at a red light can result in a citation. What's changed is that several of these states have moved from what's called secondary enforcement to primary enforcement, which is a meaningful legal distinction. Secondary enforcement means an officer can only cite you for that violation if they've already pulled you over for something else. Primary enforcement means an officer can pull you over for that violation alone, phone in hand, nothing else required. Virginia, Georgia, and Florida have all shifted toward primary enforcement on hands-free violations in recent years, which means the odds of actually receiving a citation for this have increased noticeably, independent of whether the underlying law itself changed. If you're someone who still holds your phone to check a GPS route or take a call hands-on while driving through one of these states, that's the specific habit worth breaking, because it's now a standalone reason to get pulled over in a way it wasn't a few years ago. The third law, and probably the one seniors specifically ask me about the most, involves license renewal and vision testing requirements, because several states have adjusted their rules around renewal frequency and in-person requirements as drivers get older. And getting caught driving on an expired or improperly renewed license is treated far more seriously at a routine stop than most people expect. This varies more state to state than the other two, so I want to walk through the general pattern rather than pretend there's one universal rule, because there genuinely isn't. In a number of states along the I-95 corridor, once you reach a certain age, typically somewhere between the mid-60s and mid-70s depending on the state, your license renewal cycle shortens, meaning you have to renew more frequently than younger drivers do, and in many of those states, you're also required to renew in person rather than online or by mail past a certain age, sometimes with a vision test required every single renewal rather than just periodically. The mistake I see people make constantly is assuming their license is still valid because the physical card doesn't expire for another year or two, when in fact the state's own system flagged it for early renewal based on age and the driver never got the notice or missed it, among other mail. If you're stopped for any reason and your license comes back as expired or improperly renewed in the system, even if the mistake was an outdated address on file rather than anything you did wrong, that can result in a citation on the spot in most of these states, and untangling it afterward is a lot more of a hassle than checking your renewal status today. Now let's talk about why I-95 specifically gets singled out in these videos, because there is a real reason enforcement along this corridor has increased, even though it's not some secret new senior-specific law. I-95 is one of the busiest and most heavily traveled interstates in the country, running through some of the most congested metro areas on the East Coast, and that combination of heavy traffic and long work zone stretches has made it a priority corridor for exactly the kind of enforcement I just described. Several states have installed additional automated speed detection specifically in marked work zones along I-95, and unlike a traditional speed trap, these systems don't require an officer to be present at all. The citation gets mailed to the address on file with your vehicle registration, often weeks after the violation happened. This is a real and growing trend, not a rumor, and it's worth knowing about regardless of your age, because a lot of drivers assume no officer means no citation is coming, and that assumption is increasingly wrong on this specific highway. So what should you actually do with all of this information, since panicking about it doesn't help and ignoring it doesn't help either? First, before your next long drive on I-95, especially if you're crossing through multiple states, take a few minutes to check whether your license renewal is current according to the state that issued it, not just based on the expiration date printed on the card, since some states send renewal requirements based on age brackets that don't always align with the printed date. This takes a few minutes on your state's motor vehicle website, and it's the single most common issue I hear about after the fact. Second, make hands-free a strict habit rather than an occasional one, especially now that primary enforcement means an officer doesn't need any other reason to pull you over. If you use your phone for navigation, mount it somewhere you're not required to hold it. And if a call comes in, let it go to voicemail or use a genuinely hands-free method rather than holding the phone even briefly. Third, retrain the habit around the move over law to include any vehicle with hazard lights on the shoulder, not just police and emergency vehicles, since that's the specific expansion that's been catching longtime drivers off guard. I also want to address something directly because it's the exact kind of claim these alarming videos rely on to get views. If you see a video claiming there's a brand new nationwide law effective in 2027 that specifically fines seniors for driving on I-95, ask yourself where that claim is actually coming from. Real traffic law changes come from state legislatures, they get voted on, they get signed, and they get published with an actual effective date you can look up on your own state's Department of Motor Vehicles website or in your state's official register of new laws. If a claim doesn't point you to an actual bill, an actual state, and an actual effective date, and instead just says something vague like new laws are coming for seniors this year, treat that the same way you'd treat any other unsourced claim online, with real skepticism, because the goal of a video like that is usually to keep you watching and worried, not to actually inform you. There's one more piece of this worth addressing directly, because it comes up constantly in the comments whenever I cover a topic like this. And that's the question of what actually happens once a citation is issued along one of these corridors, since the process isn't always what people expect. If you receive a mailed citation from an automated work zone camera, it typically arrives with a photograph of your vehicle's license plate and a specified window to either pay the fine or contest it. And that window is usually shorter than people assume, often 30 days or less, depending on the state. The mistake I see most often isn't ignoring the citation outright, it's setting it aside, intending to deal with it later, and letting the response window close without realizing it, which in several states converts a standard fine into a much larger penalty or triggers a hold on your registration renewal. If you ever receive one of these notices, the safest move is to read it the day it arrives rather than setting it in a pile. Confirm whether your state allows you to contest it if you believe there's an error, such as a rental vehicle registered in your name being driven by someone else at the time, and either pay or file that contest well within the stated deadline rather than close to it. It's also worth understanding why enforcement patterns like this tend to cluster around specific corridors rather than applying evenly across a whole state, since that context explains why I-95 keeps coming up in these conversations more than other highways. States generally direct additional enforcement resources, whether that's more patrol presence or more automated camera installations, toward roads with the highest volume of traffic incidents and the most complaints from local law enforcement about difficulty policing dangerous behavior at normal staffing levels. I-95 fits that description in almost every state it runs through, given how much of the East Coast commercial and commuter traffic relies on it, and that's the actual mundane reason enforcement has increased there rather than any conspiracy or age-specific targeting. Understanding that distinction matters because it means the increased enforcement isn't unique to this one highway forever. It shifts toward whichever roads see the highest incident rates in a given period. So staying generally current on renewal status, hands-free habits, and move-over awareness serves you well beyond just this one stretch of interstate. The honest bottom line on all of this is that driving along I-95 hasn't become some minefield specifically targeting older drivers through some secret new 2027 law, but enforcement on a small handful of very real, very ordinary laws has genuinely tightened in recent years across several of the states this highway passes through, and the drivers most likely to get caught off guard aren't the ones breaking new rules. They're the ones operating on habits that were perfectly fine 5 or 10 years ago and simply haven't been updated. Checking your license renewal status. Treating hands-free driving as a strict rule rather than a suggestion, and widening your understanding of the move-over law to include any shoulder vehicle with hazards on will cover the overwhelming majority of what's actually changed, and none of it requires panicking about a law that doesn't exist. If you want a state-by-state breakdown of exactly how these 3 laws are written and enforced along your specific stretch of I-95, that full breakdown is laid out in the link in the description below this video. And if you've got a specific question, whether that's about a citation you received, a renewal notice that didn't make sense, or anything else related to driving laws where you live, drop it in the comments. I read through every one of them, and they genuinely shape what I cover in the next video. Thanks for watching.